Hello everyone, welcome to Vipin Technologies. I am Vipin. So today we are going to discuss controllers in MVC 5. What are the controllers? What exactly it means in MVC 5 and how we can create controllers in MVC 5. So let's start. So before going to the Visual Studio, I would like to discuss some points that although, what is the role of a controller? So basically, whenever any request is coming from the client to the server or from the browser to the server, so basically the request goes to the controller, right? And that controller is responsible for handling that particular request, and it basically forward that request to particular action method, and accordingly that particular action method takes a decision what it has to do with that request, right? So we can say that controller it plays a very important role by handling the incoming request and providing data to the corresponding view or to browser request, right? So, so in a diagram, we can see that, just give me a second. Yeah. So in a diagram, as we can see that a client is sending a request to the server, right? So and on this server, your application is deployed by using MVC design pattern, that is controller model view, right? So when the client is sending the request to the controller, so the request firstly comes to the controller, right? But the request before it goes to the controller, some more steps are being performed before it reaches to the controller, right? So what all are those steps that I will be discussing in the upcoming videos, but as of now you understand that that the request come to the controller first, right? And accordingly, when the request is received by the controller, it basically forward that particular request to a particular action method, and that action method basically takes the decision that what it has to return, whether it has to return a view or any JSON or any file or any string or any partial view. So depending on that particular request type. So depending on that, it basically create a response and it send back to the client, as you can see in the diagram, right? So this was the basically a very brief introduction about the controller. Now let's move to the Visual Studio without wasting any time, and let's create a new application from the scratch. We need to create a new project. We'll click on this project and we need to choose this ASP.NET web application. Remember one thing, that we need to choose the latest .NET framework 4.6.1. So as of now I'm taking it 4.6.1 according to my machine, right? So I have taken this ASP.NET web application. You can give any meaningful name, so as of now I'm taking it default, right? And let's click on OK button, and now it will give you the templates. So as of now, as we are learning controllers from the scratch, so I will be going with empty. So we are going to create controllers with empty, and accordingly we have to enable the checkbox. Let's suppose if we are working with the ASP.NET web forms, in that case we need to enable this checkbox web form. But as of now we are working with MVC, so I have checked this MVC checkbox, right? So now we will click on the OK button. It will take some time and it will create a application MVC application structure for us. So let's wait for a couple of seconds. It will create. So in the meantime, it's loading all the required DLL and packages which is required in the MVC application, right? Now it has been completed. So on the right hand side we can see the solution explorer, right? But in any case, if you are not able to see the solution explorer, you can go into this menu option, that is view, and under view menu you can click on the solution explorer. From here you can get the solution explorer in case if you are not getting here, right? So and as we can see the solution explorer, we are having this application we have created just now, and inside this application we have controllers, model views. the same structure which we discussed in the last video, right? So if you haven't watched my last video, I will strongly recommend you to see first of all that video before proceeding this video, right? So now moving to the our point controllers, we can see the controller folder is empty, model is also empty, and under view under view also it is empty, right? So now we are going to create a controller. So for creating controller, we need to right click on this controller. Then we need to click on add, and where we will find a controller option. Again, I am repeating. We need to click. We need to right click on the controller. Then we need to click add, and then we need to click controller. Then after clicking on this controller, it will ask you what type of controller we want to create, whether empty controller or with read-write actions or with views using entity framework or any web API controller. So MVC provides that we can create our web API controller also and MVC 5 controller also, right? But as of now, we are learning the controller from the scratch. So I will be going with empty controllers in the upcoming videos or in the latest session. I'll let you know about the remaining these read-write actions and using entity framework, right? So as of now, we are going with MVC 5 controller empty, right? Now we will click on add button. Yes. Now it will ask us to give the controller name, any meaningful name. So as of now, we can give any meaningful name home and see that this word is automatically appended by this MVC application. So we need to define only the name, what exactly name we have to give. So as of now, I am giving home controller and clicking on add button. So it will automatically add the controller. Right, so we can see that it has under this controller folder, this home controller is automatically added, right? We can see. So, so this home controller is nothing. This is also a very, this is a normal class when we used to work with the classes. So we can see that this is a normal class with the name home controller, right? And inside this class, we have some action method. As of now, it is having one action method, but we can create, according to our need, multiple action method. And the return type of this action method is action result. So by default, the return type of all the action method in the MVC application is action result, right? So I will be discussing in a detail about this action result, but as of now, you understand that for every action method inside a controller, by default, the return type of action method is action result, right? So now we can see that this particular class, home controller class, this is being inherited from the controller class, and this controller class is coming from where? From this namespace using system.web.mbc namespace. So inside this namespace, we are having this controller class, right? So we can say that for this home controller class, this class is a base class, right? So this home controller class is basically is being inherited from controller class, right? So that's why it is called controller class, right? So now what we can do, so as we have already created this one home controller class, and we are having this index action method. And one more thing, whatever in the future we are going to create controllers or new controllers in the upcoming videos, all the controllers will resides in the controller folder. Remember this thing, right? So now let's suppose we are having this index action method, and let's suppose we delete this action method, and for the time being, let's create one public method just to make you understand about the controller, and let's name it index, right? And it's returning, let's suppose it's returning, let's suppose it's returning string, hello, I am Vipin, right? And along with this method, let's create one more method, and the return type of this method is also a string, and we name it any meaning, we give it any meaningful name. Let's suppose display, right? And in the string we can write that Vipin lives in India, right? Now let's save it. Now let's run this application. So let's see. So for running this application, we can go here and we can select in which browser we want to run. So for the timing, we are taking Chrome, and we can click on this green button, or either you can press F5 from the keyboard to run this application. So it will compile first, and then it will render in the browser. So we can see. So let's see what it will give the output. So we have defined these two methods, index and display, right? Let's see. Yes, we can see that the output it is giving hello, I am Vipin, which is defined in this method. So your MVC application is invoking this index action method, right? So the question comes into the mind, how the MVC application comes to know that it has to invoke this index action method, and why it is invoking this action method. Why not this by default? And from where it is invoking, right? So before answering to this question, let me tell you one more thing that for calling any controller or action method in the browser, right? So the pattern which we need to follow is this one, pattern to call from browser, right? So we need to define your domain name, then controller name, then action method name, right? The same thing we will do this, right? But here by default it is invoking which controller class, which this home controller, and inside this action method, right? So how it is calling? So let's before answering this, so let me show you one more thing. Let's suppose this is your domain name, then your home controller name, then action method is index action method. As we can see, the controller name is home, and inside this home controller we have index action method, right? So we are calling the same home controller and index action method. If I press enter, it will give the same output. Sorry, so I have actually closed this application. Let's rebuild, and let's see. Yeah, same we are getting. And if we enter the controller name and then action method is index, so in that case also if I press enter, it is giving same output, hello I am. And if we are not passing any controller name or action method in the URL, so in that case also it is calling by default which method, this method. So the question comes, which I just told you a few minutes back, how the MVC application comes to know that it is calling this, it has to invoke this index action method. This is happening because, as I told you in my in my previous video, if you remember, that whenever any request is coming from client to the server, so first of all the request goes to the controller, right? But before the controller, the request goes into global.acx file. So when the application loads and when the first request comes to the MVC application, so first request comes into this application start event. You can see this here, right? And inside this inside this method, we have registered this route config file, right? So if I navigate on this definition, go to definition, right? We can see the default mapping is already defined for the controller action method. You can see route.map route. So default routing, or we can say default mapping of routing is defined. It's already defined. We can see that default routing is what? Your home controller, then index action method, right? So that's why it is by default calling home controller and index action method. So if we go into the home controller and the index action method, so that's why it is giving the this output. So that's why it is calling this method. And let's suppose if we want to call this method, then what we will do in the browser, we'll go, we'll write the controller name is same home. As we can see, controller name is same home, and inside this controller we need to call display method. So we will write display method and then press enter. It will give the output. We need to run it again. So let's load. We need to just, I have reached the breakpoint, right? So by default, it is invoking your home controller and index action method. Hello, I am Vipin. It's giving output. Now we want to call the second method home and the display method. See, now it is giving Vipin live in India. And that means this output, right? So so we need to follow this pattern which I discussed with you, that how to call controller name and particular action method name. We need to define domain name, then controller name, then action method name. And accordingly, we have defined your domain name. Oh, sorry, this one domain name and controller name and then action method. So, so let's suppose if we have created one more method, right? And we want to call that third method, right? Let's stop and let's create one more method and we write let's suppose get details, right? And over here return type of this method is string. So let's suppose we write that India is a democratic country, right? Now save it. Now let's run it again. Now inside this controller we are having now three methods, three action methods: index, display, and get details method, right? So let's, it should load first of all. So by default, it will call this one, index action method. Hello, I am Vipin. You can see, right? And now we need to call another action method inside the same controller, home controller. And now we need to call this method. Let's suppose get details. It will give the output and press the enter. It will give the output. India is a democratic country, right? We can see it is returning this. Now if we call display, then it will give the output for display. Weapon live in India. You can see this output, right? So this is the way how we can call the action methods uh, for the given controller inside the in a browser when we are defining the URL, right? Okay. So so let's come back to the slides. So if we uh, talk about controller, so what we can see that controller.cs file which resides in controller folder. We can see all the controller resides in the controller folder, right? So let's suppose if we are going to create some more new controllers, all those controller will be placed inside this controller folder, right? And controller used to handle the browser incoming HTTP request and get data from models if required, and providing data to corresponding views or request, and accordingly it generate the response and it sent back to the client, right? And for the action method, that I told you that a method inside a controller is called as action method. Let's suppose this one, a method inside this controller is called action method, right? All these methods are called action method. And by default, the return type of all the action method is by default action result, which I told you just few minutes back, right? And let's suppose when we are invoking from the URL, you can see that home controller and the index and the action method name, right? So for calling any action method directly from the browser, we need to mark that action method as a public with the public access modifier, right? If we will mark it as a private or protected, then we are not able to call it from the browser directly. So for calling any action method directly from the browser, we need to mark that action method with the public keyword, right? So that is being said here in the slide also. Only a public method can be accessed from the HTTP request. HTTP request here, I mean when we are sending the request from the browser, right? And by default all action method I get, and action method can return views, partial views, file, JSON string format, or any string, right? So depending on the type of request, what request a particular action method is getting, accordingly it takes the decision and gives the output, right? So that we will be discussing in the upcoming videos in a very detail, so don't worry, right? So as of now, what we have learned that how to create a controller in a MVC application, and how we can create action methods, and how we can call it directly from the browser, right? Now let's suppose uh, we want to get some data, we want to get some employee data from our database, or any student data from the database, right? So in that case, let's suppose we want to create a new controller, right, for the getting all the details of the employee. So what we will do, we'll go to the controller again, we'll click on add, and we'll add this controller. So we are going to create one more new controller, and taking the same empty. Now we are clicking on add, and now we need to give the meaningful name of the controller. Let's suppose I'm giving employee controller, right? So we are going to create an employee controller. So it will automatically add that employee controller under the controller folder. You can see employee controller.cs file. So all the controllers are going to reside in the controller folder. Now under this employee controller, we can see by default we have this index action method, right? So for the time being, let's delete it, and we are going to create one method. Let's suppose this one, and we can name it, and let's suppose if there is a need that we want to pass some data from the URL, right? So how we can do this? So we can do this. So we can pass parameter in this action method. Let's suppose int ID, and we are returning that particular ID. So let's suppose return ID, and we are concatenating whatever the ID is coming from the request, right? Now save it. Now run it. Now we run this. Let's see. So we have to invoke employee controller and the display action method this time, right? But by default it will invoke which one? Your home controller and the index action method, this one. So let's see. Yes, by default it is calling home controller and the index action method, but we need to call this time employee controller, and under employee controller we need to call display action method. So go to the browser. So we need to type the controller name is employee now this time, and then the action method name is display, right? You can see display, right? And along with this we need to pass ID. Let's suppose we are passing ID 45. Now pressing enter. Now the control is coming in this display action method, and see in the ID we are getting 45, whatever what we passed in the URL 45, right? And it will display the output your ID equal to 45, right? So now the question comes again, how it is how the MVC application comes to know that in the ID it has to bind 45, which we are passing in the URL. So for that also, when the request is coming, firstly the request comes into global.asx file, which I told you, and under this we are registering route configuration. So when we go to this definition, we can see already a default mapping is defined, right? And the default mapping, what is there? Home controller, then index action method, and your ID parameter is optional, right? So when so id is optional parameter. So after the index action method or any action method, if we are passing this parameter, so it will automatically bind the data in this id parameter, right? Yeah, so that's why it is mapping the data in this parameter, right? Now let's suppose we have a requirement that we need to pass multiple parameters in our application, right? There might be scenarios. So let's suppose uh, we can say that mm, let's suppose we have to pass more than one parameter. We have to pass more than one parameter in the browser, right? In this browser. So, and we need to pass all those data into this method. So what we can do, we can pass, let's suppose, let's create one more method. So to make you more understand, and the method name, let's suppose, getting details, right? And along with this id parameter, let's take one more parameter. Let's suppose this department, and with the department it will give the output it plus department, and it will give the department, right? So now this time in the url we would be passing two parameters, id and department, right? So let's see, let's place a breakpoint here so that the control comes here. We can check the data. Now save the file and run the application. Now this time we need to call this method, getting detailed action method inside the employee controller. So it is being loaded. So let's see. Yeah. Now we need to call employee controller, right? Because we need to call this controller, and under this controller we need to call getting details method, getting details method, and now we need to pass multiple parameters. So for passing multiple parameters in the url, we have to use the concept of query string by placing this question mark and the id. Let's suppose we are passing 32, and other parameter department we are passing let's suppose finance, right? Now enter. Now the control is coming here. So let's debug, and now we can see that in this id parameter we are getting 32, and in the department we are getting finance, right? So when we click on the output, we can see that id equal to 32 and the department equal to finance. So whatever we are passing in the query string, so all these parameters are being mapped into this parameter id department. But remember one thing, that these parameter name should exactly match in the url whatever we are taking here. So if we are passing id and department, so exactly these parameters should match with these parameters, then only it will bind the data, otherwise it will throw an error, right? So let's now this time by passing id, let's suppose 65. Now press enter. Now this time in the id it is getting 65 and the department is finance. So the output will be id equal to 65 and department equal to finance, right? Now let's suppose we have a scenario that we want to make this parameter nullable, right? And when we are using nullable parameter means that let's suppose whether I want to send data I want to send data for this parameter from the URL, or whether I don't want to send data for this parameter from the URL. So in both cases, our application should work, right? So when we are sending value for this parameter, in that case also it will work. And let's suppose if we are not passing any value for this parameter in the query string, in that case also our application should work. So for that, we need to mark this parameter null. So let's suppose let's take one integer parameters to make you more understand, and take let's suppose age, and accordingly we need to write it here age. And now we need to make this parameter nullable. So for making any parameter nullable, we need to mark with question mark. We need to mention question mark in front of that parameter name, right? And also we need to pass the default value for that parameter. Let's suppose 0 we are passing, right? Now let's save and run the application. Now we'll see both the cases when we are passing the value for this age parameter and when we are not passing the value for this parameter, right? Why it is saying access denied? Okay, save. Now run. So let's run it again. Build succeeded. So by default it will load the home controller and the index section method, but we need to call employee controller, and we need to call this employee controller and this action method, right? So we need this domain name, we need to define employee controller and then getting details, right? And now let's suppose we are passing ID 89, and the department we are passing data, right? Press enter. You can see in the ID we are getting 89, whatever we passed, and in the age, okay, oh sorry, actually we need to pass age parameter from here in the URL. So let's stop debugging and run it again. Now we need to pass employee controller, then you're getting details, right? And then we need to pass query string. First parameter is ID, so let's suppose we are taking 22, and the other parameter is department, the parameter is age, right? In the age we are passing, let's suppose 55, right? Pressing enter. So now this time we are passing a parameter for both the values. ID is 22 and the age is 55, right? So accordingly it is taking that parameter value ID 22 and department is 55, right? We need to write age over here. So, and let's suppose now this time we are not passing this age parameter. Now what will happen? Will the application break? No. In that case also it will work because we have make this parameter nullable age, right? So it will take the now default value, that is 0. Now press enter. Now the ID is 22 and the age is 0. So application is working fine. You can see ID 22, department is 0. Instead of department, we need to add age, that I need to change over here, right? So let's do it, save it and run it. Yeah, so it is running successfully. Let's wait for the yes. And now we can write employee controller, and accordingly, let's suppose we are taking this one. Now we are not passing the age parameter, right? So in that case, it will take the default value. We can see this ID 22 age 0. And let's suppose if we are passing age parameter, so let's suppose we are passing now age equal to 100. So now it will give the output 100 for age. We can see age equal to 100, right? So that was the basically simple, you can say a simple introduction about the controllers, how we can create a controllers and how we can define the action method inside a controller and how we can call it from the browser as we have seen, and how we can pass the multiple parameters in our action method. And let me tell you one more thing. Let's suppose we do have one more method to get the data from the URL, which we are getting from the URL from the request.queryString object. That's a very older method, but we should know that approach also. So let's suppose if I remove from here age, and for age we are getting the request, we are getting data from request.queryString, and the name of that particular key name is age, right? Now save this file, and now let's run and see the output, what it will give the output. So this time we are going to fetch the data for age by using this request.queryString method. So let's see. Employee controller, now getting details, and age we are passing. You can see age we are passing 100, right, and ID 22. So let's see. Now the in the query string we can see that your age is 100, right? So F5, we can see ID 22, age 100. Let's suppose if we are changing the value from 100 to 56, and now ID is we are passing 3, right? Now enter. Now in the age, we can see in the age 56 and ID 3, whatever we passed in the browser, same ID 3 and the age 56, right? So this is the basically these are the various method that how we can get the data which is being passed in the URL in our action method, and accordingly that particular action method can take the decision what it has to do, whether it has to return view or partial view, or it has to hit to the database and fetch the data from the database and it will give the output to the view, or it has to return any JSON or string. So depending on the type of request, what kind of request it is getting, right? So that was the very all, you can say, basic understanding about the controller. And now let's flip to the our slides that what we have learned, as I already told you about action method, that a method inside a controller is called action method. So all the method which we are defining inside a controller is called action method. This one action method, this one action method, right? And the default return type of action method is action result. So that I will be discussing in the upcoming videos, so don't worry about that. Let's suppose if we let's suppose if we create one, we want to create one more controller, so we'll simply add one more controller. Now this time we are going to create read write action controller. Now click on add, and now we are giving a meaningful name for the controller. Let's suppose this time student controller. Now press enter. The controller will be automatically added inside the controller folder. You can see here that student controller is being added. Now you can see that inside the student controller, all these are the action method which is being automatically generated by the MVC application, right, to make our work easier, right? So one more thing I would like to tell you, that all the index action method, all the action method inside a controller are by default get request. You can see this get request. So these are the basically verbs which are placed on the top of the action method name. You can see that this action method is your post type request. That means it is going to create a record, or it is going to insert some record in your database. So that's why that particular request is HTTP post, right? So you can see that get request, getting details on the basis of ID, so that is also get request, right? And this is also you can see this one added on the basis of ID. We can update or get any record, and we can, so these are the basically all the CRUD operations, right? Which we need to perform with the database when we are interacting with the database, right? So all the action method, you can see all the action method are having return type action result. So in the upcoming videos, I will be telling you about all these action result return types. So don't worry about that. And only public method can be accessed from the HTTP request that I already told you from the browser. When we want to call any index action method, we need to mark that index action method as a public. You can see all the index action method are by default public mark. If we mark private or protected, then we are not able to call it directly from the browser, right? So and action method can return view, partial view, JSON file, string, etc. Right? So these are, and this is the pattern to call from the browser, how we can call your any action method name, your domain, then controller name, then action method name, right? These are and these we have already discussed, that how to pass multiple parameters for a particular action method with the help of query string, right? That we have already discussed. Your controller name, then action method name, then these are the query string data, and this one is your domain name, right? Yeah. So that is all for that is all for the controller. And in the upcoming videos, we would be discussing about more about model views in a very detail. So if you have any queries related to this controller, so please post me in the comment section. I'll give you a reply. So that is all for today. So bye bye. Take care. So let's meet in the next video.